Imagine the most beautiful color you have ever seen in your life. Not just beautiful. Dangerously, impossibly beautiful. The kind of color that makes you stop breathing for just a moment when you walk into a room. That was the green of the 1860s. And it was killing everyone who wore it. London, 1862. The gas lamps are burning low across the city, casting long golden shadows over cobblestones still wet from the evening rain. Inside the grand ballrooms of Mayfair and Kensington, something extraordinary is happening. The wealthiest women in the world have arrived. And they are wearing a color so vivid, so electrifyingly alive, that the painters and poets of the era would struggle to describe it properly. It was not the soft, muted green of moss or meadow. It was something else entirely. Something almost unnatural. A green so saturated and so luminous under gaslight that it seemed to pulse. It seemed to breathe. The women who wore it were considered the pinnacle of modern sophistication. Their gowns were architectural achievements. Layers of silk and tulle and carefully pressed taffeta, adorned with hundreds of tiny handcrafted flowers along the hems and sleeves and necklines. Roses, ferns, ivy, lilies of the valley. All of them dyed or painted in that extraordinary shade of green. All of them trembling gently as their wearers moved across the ballroom floor. Every woman in Europe wanted to be one of those women. No one knew, yet, that those women were slowly being poisoned. The color had a name. Several names, actually, depending on who was selling it. Chilis green. Emerald green. Paris green. The names changed but the chemistry did not. Beneath the beauty was a compound called copper arsenite. Arsenic. One of the most efficient poisons nature has ever produced. And it had been pressed, painted, dyed, and woven into virtually every fashionable green fabric being sold in the Western world. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what the world looked like before this green existed. For most of human history, green was one of the most difficult colors to produce reliably in textiles and paints. The dyes available to craftsmen for centuries were organic, extracted from plants and minerals, and they faded. They shifted. A beautiful green gown might become a yellowish, muddy disappointment after a single season. The wealthy wanted permanence. They wanted a green that looked as vivid on a Tuesday afternoon 6 months later as it had on the night of the ball. They wanted a green that declared to everyone in the room that its wearer had the means to acquire something extraordinary. In 1775, a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele synthesized the compound that would bear his name. Scheele's green was everything the textile and pigment industries had been searching for. It was brilliant. It was stable. It bonded with extraordinary tenacity to fabric and paper and paint. And it was cheap to produce at industrial scale. Within decades of its discovery, it was everywhere. Not just in fashion, but in wallpaper, in children's toys, in artificial flower arrangements, in the decorative papers used to wrap food. In candles. In book covers. In the wax used to color confections and sweets. The Victorians did not merely like this green. They were obsessed with it. It was the dominant decorative color of the mid-19th century in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. Entire rooms were papered in it. Entire wardrobes were built around it. It was the color of modernity, of ambition, of taste. And no one in the mainstream understood what it was actually made of. Or if they did, they chose not to think too hard about it. The first people to die were not the women in the ballrooms. They were the women who made the gowns. Understand the world these women lived in. London in the 1860s was a city of extraordinary inequality pressed together in close proximity. The same streets that led to the grand townhouses of Mayfair also led to cramped, poorly ventilated workrooms where young women sat for 12, 14, 16 hours a day producing the ornamental details that made those grand gowns so spectacular. They were called milliners, dress lodgers, artificial flower makers. They were paid almost nothing. They had no legal protections and no recourse. And every day, for hours without interruption, they handled the arsenic-laden fabric and dye that was slowly, methodically destroying their bodies from the outside in. The symptoms did not come all at once. That was part of what made the pattern so difficult to see at first. A young woman might notice that her fingertips had become raw and tender. She might develop small ulcerations around her fingernails that refused to heal. Her eyes might begin to water chronically. She might develop a persistent cough that the doctors of the era, using the framework available to them, would attribute to the damp air or to constitutionally weak lungs. She might lose weight. She might feel a burning sensation in her throat each morning when she woke. She would keep working. Because stopping work meant not eating. Then the cases began to accelerate. And they became impossible to dismiss. A young woman named Matilda Scherer was 19 years old and worked as an artificial flower maker in London. Her job, every single day, was to dust the fabric flowers with a bright green powder before they were attached to the gowns and hats and decorative wreaths that would adorn the city's fashionable class. She held those flowers in her bare hands.
Silent.
She breathed the dust that rose from them. It settled on her skin, in her hair, under her fingernails, in her lungs. By late 1861, Matilda was dying.
I know, Doctor.
The doctor who attended her in her final hours left a clinical report that still reads like something from a horror story. Her fingernails had turned green. The whites of her eyes had turned green. She convulsed repeatedly. She vomited a substance that was, unmistakably, green. She told the doctor before she lost consciousness that everything she saw had taken on a green tinge. As if the world itself had been poisoned along with her. She was 19 years old. Her case was not unique. It was simply the one that finally broke into the newspapers with enough detail that the public could not look away. Investigations that followed her death revealed that workshops across London were full of women in various stages of the same poisoning. Some had already died and their deaths had been attributed to other causes. Tuberculosis. General debility. The vague Victorian catch-all of female weakness. Now, suddenly, there was a thread to pull. And the people pulling it were horrified by where it led. The problem with arsenic in fabric was not simply that it was toxic to touch. The real nightmare was in its physical behavior once the fabric was in motion. Copper arsenite does not bond to textile fibers the way a modern synthetic dye does. It sits on the surface of the fabric. It adheres, but only loosely. And when a gown made of this fabric was worn, especially during the kind of vigorous movement involved in dancing, the arsenic did not stay on the dress. It became airborne. It released itself in a fine, nearly invisible dust with every swirl of a skirt, every gesture of an arm, every breath taken by the woman wearing it and the people around her. Imagine the ballroom now with this knowledge in mind. Dozens of women in green gowns, moving through gaslit air in an enclosed space, essentially releasing a continuous fine mist of arsenic dust into the atmosphere they and their partners were breathing. The men who danced closest to these women were breathing it. The women themselves were inhaling it with every step. The servants who collected the gowns at the end of the evening and stored them were exposed to it. The maids who brushed and pressed the fabric the following morning were breathing it in the quiet intimacy of a private room with no ventilation at all. The houses of the wealthy were, in many cases, no safer than the workshops. Because the same arsenic that was in the fabric was also in the wallpaper. The fashionable greens of Victorian interior decoration, those rich, botanical patterns of ferns and leaves and climbing ivy that lined the walls of drawing rooms and nurseries across Britain, were printed with the same compounds. William Morris, perhaps the most celebrated designer of the era, whose work defined the visual identity of the Victorian home for a generation, had his patterns printed with arsenic-based greens. His family, it emerged later, had a financial stake in an arsenic mine in Devon. Morris himself would spend years dismissing the health concerns as exaggerated, as sentimental, as unscientific. He would eventually, quietly, revise his position. But by then the wallpaper had already been in millions of homes for decades. Doctors began to connect cases that had previously seemed unrelated. Families who moved into newly papered homes and began experiencing strange, chronic symptoms. Nausea, fatigue, skin lesions, respiratory problems that no treatment seemed to resolve. Children who seemed to decline inexplicably in otherwise comfortable domestic circumstances. In some cases, investigators found that the culprit was not the fabric at all, but the walls. The arsenic in the wallpaper, in conditions of moisture or poor ventilation, could be converted by a common household mold into a volatile gaseous compound called trimethylarsine. It was odorless, invisible, and it drifted through the rooms of Victorian homes like an uninvited guest that never left. The Victorians were, in a very real sense, living inside their own poison. And then the doctors published their findings, and the journalists wrote their stories, and the public was told, in plain language, what the green actually was and what it was actually doing. And here is where the story takes a turn that is almost impossible to believe unless you understand something fundamental and very uncomfortable about human behavior. People kept wearing it. Not out of ignorance. Not because they had not heard. The newspaper coverage was extensive. The medical reports were published and summarized in the popular press in language any literate reader could follow. The deaths of women like Matilda Schurer had been reported in detail. The mechanism of poisoning had been explained. Doctors were advising their patients explicitly to dispose of green garments. And the response from a significant portion of fashionable society was, essentially, a collective shrug. Some women said they did not believe it. That it was exaggerated. That if the dye were truly so dangerous, surely someone in authority would have banned it. That they personally had worn green for years and felt perfectly fine. That the women who died must have had some prior weakness or susceptibility that made them unusual cases. Others said something that was, in its own way, even more disturbing. They said they knew it might be dangerous, but that they were not willing to be the only woman in the room not wearing the fashionable color. That the social cost of appearing unfashionable, of appearing poor or behind the times or indifferent to elegance, was a cost they were not willing to pay. Vanity versus survival. And vanity, for a meaningful portion of Victorian society, won. The fashion industry itself responded to the controversy not by reforming but by managing public perception. Manufacturers hired physicians to write pamphlets arguing that the levels of arsenic in their particular products were within safe tolerances. They questioned the methodology of the independent researchers. They suggested that the problem, if it existed at all, was limited to the cheaper products made by their competitors. They sponsored reassuring articles in women's magazines. The structure of this response, the funding of doubt, the appeal to uncertainty, the targeting of individual bad actors rather than systemic practice, would become a template that the tobacco industry would later use with such devastating effectiveness in the 20th century. The user wants me to write part 2 of the documentary narration script, continuing from where part 1 left off, finishing the story in about 1,000 words, covering the Manchester beer poisoning briefly, the modern parallel with fast fashion and microplastics, and a final reflection. No quotes, brackets, time markers, with for breathing pauses. Part 2 of 2. Underscore 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 underscore. The refusal was not universal. There were women who read the reports and immediately stripped the green from their wardrobes. There were physicians who refused to attend social engagements where the color was present. There were designers who quietly began transitioning to safer pigments. But these were the minority. And the minority, in fashion, is by definition invisible. What made the situation truly extraordinary was the geometry of who was suffering most and who was making the choice continue. The women dying in the workrooms had no choice at all. They could not refuse the work. They could not demand safer materials. They had no union, no legal standing, no public voice that carried weight. They were simply dying, quietly, in rooms that the fashionable world never had to see or think about. The women in the ballrooms, the ones whose choices were actually driving the demand for the poisoned fabric, were suffering less acutely because their exposure came through wearing the finished garment rather than constructing it. And that distance, that cushion of suffering absorbed by someone else further down the chain, made it easier to maintain the comfortable belief that the danger was probably overstated. The distance between the person who pays for beauty and the person who pays the price for it. That distance is not a Victorian invention. It is one of the oldest and most durable mechanisms of human civilization. And arsenic, as it turned out, was not content to stay in the dresses. By the time the green fashion began its slow decline in the 1870s, investigators following the trail of arsenic poisoning through British society had found it in places that had nothing to do with fabric at all. It was in the nursery wallpaper. It was in the children's toy paint. It was in the colored wrappers on imported confections. It was in the artificial flower arrangements that decorated dinner tables. It was, in the most literal sense possible, woven into the domestic fabric of Victorian life at every level. And then, in 1900, it turned up in the beer. In the industrial north of England, in the cities of Manchester and Salford, thousands of people began falling ill with a baffling cluster of symptoms. Numbness in the extremities, skin lesions, severe neurological deterioration. Doctors were confounded. The scale of it was enormous. More than 6,000 cases were eventually documented. Somewhere between 70 and 100 people died. The source, when investigators finally traced it, was arsenic. Not from fabric this time. Not from wallpaper. It had contaminated the glucose used in large-scale beer production, introduced through the sulfuric acid used in the brewing process. Industrial arsenic, migrating through supply chains that no one was adequately monitoring, finding its way into the pint glasses of working men who had no idea that the thing they were drinking to relax after a day of labor was slowly destroying their nervous systems. No one had intended to poison them. That was perhaps the most unsettling part of the whole affair. There was no villain in a dramatic sense. There was simply a system operating at industrial scale with insufficient oversight, in which the movement of toxic materials through complex supply chains was nobody's specific responsibility until people started dying in large enough numbers to force an inquiry. The arsenic was everywhere because no one was watching for it everywhere. And no one was watching for it everywhere because the assumption underlying industrial society was that efficiency and growth were the primary values, and that the burden of proof lay with those claiming harm rather than with those producing it. That assumption did not end with the Victorians. We look back at this era now with a kind of horrified fascination. We marvel at the ignorance. We shake our heads at the vanity. We find it almost comic that a society capable of such extraordinary achievements in literature and science and engineering could simultaneously be poisoning itself with its own wallpaper and ball gowns and beer and not connecting the dots quickly enough to stop. But before you allow yourself too much comfortable distance from those gas-lit ballrooms, consider the cotton. Right now, somewhere in Bangladesh or Cambodia or Vietnam, a young woman is sitting in a factory that lacks adequate ventilation. She is working with dyes and solvents and finishing chemicals whose long-term effects on human health are not fully understood and are certainly not being monitored systematically. She is being paid less in a day than the cost of the garment she is producing. She will never be able to afford to buy it. She is the Matilda Schurer of our era. And the distance between her workroom and your wardrobe is doing the same work that distance has always done. It is making it easier not to think too hard about what you are participating in. The clothes you wear are not the only thing drifting invisibly through your air. Microplastics, shed from synthetic fabrics every time they are washed or worn, have been found in human lung tissue, in placentas, in the bloodstream. They are in the tap water. In the fish. In the salt on your table. Their long-term effects on human biology are not yet fully understood. The studies are ongoing. The results are being debated. And the industry that produces them is funding the debate with a patience and a strategic sophistication that Carl Wilhelm Scheele, working alone in his Swedish laboratory in 1775, could never have imagined. We are not post-Victorian. We are Victorian with better technology and longer supply chains. The green that killed Matilda Schurer took decades to disappear from the market after its dangers were established. Not because people did not know, but because the structure of desire is more powerful than the structure of reason when the cost is being paid by someone you never have to see. When the suffering is downstream of the beauty. When the poison is invisible to the person who benefits from it. That is the story the Victorians are actually telling us. Not a story about ignorance. Not a story about a more primitive time that we have long since outgrown. A story about what human beings are willing to believe when believing otherwise would be too inconvenient. A story that is still being written. And we are all still wearing the green.